Hi there. It's hot. It's really hot. I mean... So I've been digging into the old Tsundoku Vault, and I found this book of heartbreak, madness, sex, love, betrayal, outsiders, intoxication, war, whimsy, horrors, God, death, dinner, baseball, travels, the art of writing, and everything else in the world. This is the Paris Review since 1953, and I've been digging into it randomly. And I wanted to show you what I found, so let's take a look-see. So I got this book around the time it came out, which is about 20 years ago, I think. Yeah, copyright 2003. And I've read maybe half of it or less in 20 years. Yeah, that's the kind of guy I am. That's probably why I'm sitting here making this video instead of, writing or trying to publish anything that I've ever worked on, or just kind of staring off down the road of good intentions while my dreams flicker like heat waves. But I like collections like this because you can discover all kinds of amazing writers and poets and cool stories and yeah. I said collection, but it says compendium. What's the difference between a collection and a compendium? Do you know? Anthology? I don't know. What is the Paris Review anyway? Well, it's a magazine that started back in the 50s, and it's had some of the greatest writers, interviews about the writing process, editing, poetry, art. You can see here I've got some of the recent issues, not so recent, but a couple years back. I like these because they're small, they're easy to carry around, and they've just got all kinds of amazing stuff in here. You might think the Paris Review is pretentious, and it can be. Literature is still an antidote to all of the nonsense and negativity and politics, and if you want to get off the screen, if you need to slow down, if you need to clear out your mind, and then fill it with something that's provocative, something that inspires, just feed your head, as they say. It's good stuff, for the most part. Table of contents here. George Plimpton, the editor, not Bill Plimpton. And you got Lori Moore, you got Raymond Carver, Zelda Fitzgerald. You got Donald Bartholomew, John Updike, William T. Volman, Nabokov, Rick Moody, Toni Morrison, Margaret Atwood, David Foster Wallace, Franzen's in there, Jonathan Lethem, Truman Capote, Charles Simic, Alice Munro, Stanley Elkin, William Faulkner, John Irving, Hunter S. Thompson, William Burroughs, Jim Carroll, Dennis Johnson. It's funny, when we get to the Intoxication section, I love all of these people. Mary McCarthy as well. Italo Calvino, Kurt Vonnegut. Good stuff. Faulkner's in here a few times, so let's look at him first. From The Art of Fiction 12, Faulkner says, "My own experience has been that the tools I need for my trade are paper, tobacco, food, and a little whiskey." Interviewer says, "Bourbon, you mean?" "Nah, I ain't that particular. Between scotch and nothing, I'll take scotch." It's so awesome. That's all he needed. Along a similar vein, Hunter S. Thompson, from The Art of Journalism 1. Interviewer says, "The drug culture. How do you write when you're under the influence?" Thompson, "My theory for years has been to write fast and get through it. I usually write 5 pages a night and leave them out for my assistant to type in the morning." Interviewer, "This after a night of drinking and so forth?" Thompson, "Oh yes, always, yes. I found that there's only one thing I can't work on, and that's marijuana. Even acid I could work with. The only difference between the sane and the insane is that the sane have the power to lock up the insane. Either you function or you don't. Functionally insane? If you get paid for being crazy, if you can get paid for running amok and writing about it, I call that sane. Interviewer. Almost without exception, writers we've interviewed over the years admit they cannot write under the influence of booze or drugs, or at the least, what they've done has to be rewritten in the cool of the day. What's your comment about this? Thompson. They lie. Or maybe you've been interviewing a very narrow spectrum of writers. It's like saying, almost without exception, women we've interviewed over the years swear that they never indulge in sodomy, without saying that you did all your interviews in a nunnery. Did you interview Coleridge? Did you interview Poe, or Scott Fitzgerald, or Mark Twain, or Fred Exley? Did Faulkner tell you that what he was drinking all the time was really iced tea, not whiskey? Please. Who the fuck do you think wrote the Book of Revelation? A bunch of stone-sober clerics? What would you do if a friend of a friend showed up at your house and he had danced with your wife at parties? Maybe even kissed her on occasion. You'd barely remember him from the old days. Now he's bedraggled, homeless. Would you let him in? To further complicate the situation, you and your wife are about to go on a vacation for 2 weeks. This is the opening of The Guest by Stanley Elkin, one of the funniest, strangest, saddest stories that I've ever read. The main character, Birdie, has been on a swing through the southern states and stops off in St. Louis to see the Feldmans, and it's obvious that he is not wanted there. From the opening sequence, we can see that Birdie ain't right. And long story short, the Feldmans end up asking Birdie to house sit for them, reluctantly, while they go on vacation. And I love this on page 359. "It's all right," Birdie said. "Certainly it's all right," Feldman said. "What harm could you do?" "I'm harmless," Birdie said. From that moment, even though we've only seen Birdie briefly, we know that he's perhaps not as harmless as he seems, and probably this situation is going to get out of control. Feldman picked up the suitcase and led his wife toward the door. "Have a good time," Birdie said, following them. "I'll watch things for you." Feldman waved back at him as he went down the stairs. "Hey," Birdie called, leaning over the banister. "Did I tell you about that crazy Claff? You know what Nutty Claff did out at UCLA? He became a second-story man." Now, I didn't know this slang term, second-story man, but I guess that's slang for the burglar who breaks into the second floor. And so already there's some foreshadowing that, he hasn't exactly broken into their apartment, but he's keeping some strange company, and everything's going to go to hell. I love this sequence. As soon as the Feldmans are gone, Birdie looks around and kind of mutters to himself, "How the fallen are mighty." He remembered his need to rest. In the living room, he lay down on the couch without taking off his shoes. He sat up and pulled them off, but when he lay down again, he was uneasy. He had gotten out of the habit, living the way he did, of sleeping without shoes. In his friends' leaseless basements, the nights were cold and he wore them for warmth. He put the shoes on again, but found he wasn't tired anymore. It was a fact that dependence gave him energy. He was never so alert as when people did him favors. It was having to be on your own that made you tired. And now Birdie begins wandering around through the apartment, and he's lecturing a committee that has formed in his head. It says, as he lectured the committee, he wandered around the apartment, touring from right to left. He crossed from the living room into the dining room and turned right into the kitchen, and then right again into the small room Feldman used for his study. "Here's where all the magic happens," Birdie said, glancing at the contour chair near Feldman's desk. He went back into the kitchen. "Here's where all the magic happens," he said, looking at Norma's electric stove. He stepped into the dining room and continued on, passing Norma's paintings of picturesque little side streets in Mexico, of picturesque little side streets in Italy, of picturesque little side streets in Puerto Rico, until he came to a door that led to the back sun parlor. He went through it and found himself in a room with an easel, with paints in sexy little tubes, with brushes, with palettes, and turpentine and rags. "Here's where all the magic happens," Birdie said, and walked around the room to another door. He opened it, and he was in the Feldmans' master bedroom. He looked at the bed. "Here's where all the magic happens," he said. Through a door at the other end of the room was another small hall. On the right was the toilet. He went in and flushed it. And then he begins to become a rental agent, explaining about how this kind of toilet is the best to have. He finds their vinyl records, and he picks up one and he breaks it over his knee. And then he finally settles on Billie Holiday. He begins talking with his absent friends, Claff and Gimple, and doing their voices as well as responding to them, even though he's alone. And then Bertie has a bit of nausea, and we begin to realize that he is going through the beginnings of withdrawal, drug withdrawal. Bertie hugged his knees, and then again felt a wave of the nauseous sickness he had experienced that morning. Now, we haven't seen him that morning, but it is obvious that he is in a very fragile state. When the nausea left him, he thought again about his situation. It was odd, he thought, being alone in so big a place. There were always people to do him favors, give him money, beer, drugs, to nurse him back to his normal state of semi-invalidism. Girls to kiss him in the comforting way he liked. This was probably the first time he had been alone in months. He felt like a dog whose master has gone away for the weekend. Just then he heard some people coming up the stairs, and he growled experimentally. He went down on his hands and knees and scampered to the door, scratching it with his nails. "Ruggaf!" he barked. "Ruggaf!" He heard whoever it was fumbling to open a door on the floor below him. He smiled. "Good dog," he said. "Good dog, good dog, good dog, good dog, good dog, good dog." He whined. He missed his master. A tear formed in the corner of his left eye. He crawled to a full-length mirror in the bathroom. "Ah," he said, "ah." Seeing the patch across his eye, he had an inspiration. "Here, Patch," he called. "Come on, Patch." He romped after his own voice. I love that line, he romped after his own voice. And then he falls asleep on the floor. So after he falls asleep on the floor, being a dog, he wakes up, it's 1:30 in the morning, and he's hungry. And he had needled some money out of Feldman. Feldman left him $20 for 2 weeks, which in the early 1960s, $20 was probably a little more than $200. So he takes this and he orders out. He orders a pizza. And they say, it's going to take more than an hour. And so he says, put it in a cab. So while he's waiting for the pizza to be delivered, he contemplates committing suicide. He also remembers that he has the last of his drugs stashed in his trumpet case, because Bertie is a wandering jazzman who has been kicked out of bands because of his poor musicianship. And when the pizza arrives in the taxi, he gives the $20 to the taxi driver. And he said, "I can't change that." And Bertie says, keep the change. And so he now has no money and one pizza and a 6-pack of beer to last him for 2 weeks. And of course he also has his drugs, and there's a liquor cabinet in the apartment. And so we know things are just going from bad to worse. For some reason, Bertie orders mushroom pizza, then he picks off all the mushrooms. He pours the beer into a champagne glass, drinks it, throws the glass behind him. It crashes onto the floor, as well as spilling all over one of Norma's paintings. Next, I'd like to read 2 passages that I think really demonstrate how the author Stanley Elkin is able to show Bertie's character in such a brief, memorable, and funny way. The first passage here has to do with quirks of Bertie's character, and I just love this part. He went then into the other bedroom and ripped the spread from the big double bed. For some time, in fact, since he had first seen it, Bertie had been thinking about this bed. It was the biggest bed he would ever sleep in. He thought invariably in such terms. One cigarette in a pack would suddenly become distinguished in his mind as the best or the worst he would smoke that day. A homely act, such as tying his shoelaces, if it had occurred with unusual ease, would be remembered forever. This lent to his vision an oblique sadness, conscious as he was that he was forever encountering experiences which would never come his way again. All right, the second passage here has to do with Bertie's outlook in terms of how he sees his fellow members of society, for example, the Feldmans. He has a very unique perspective. It was strange, Bertie thought seriously. It was the paradox of the world and an institutional insight that might have come right out of the mouth of that slut in Dallas. But the most peculiar aspect of the squares wasn't their lack of imagination or their bland bad taste, but their ability, like the wildest fanatics, like the furthest out of the furthest out, to cling to the illogical, finally untenable notion that they must have and have in order to live. At the same time, they realized that it was better not to have. What seemed so grand to Bertie, who admired all impossible positions, was that they believed both things with equal intensity, never suspecting for a moment any inconsistency. And here was Bertie thought, here was Bertie, inside their capital, on the slopes of their mountains, on their smooth shores, who believed neither of these propositions, who believed in not having, and in not suffering too, who yet realized the very same pleasure they would in having and not using. It was the strangest thing that would ever happen to him, he thought. And this is about 3 days into his stay at the apartment, so the pizza is completely stale and probably getting moldy. And I think that paragraph is so interesting and says so much about Bertie, because the Feldmans are these very well-to-do Jewish couple that they live in this nice apartment with a lease, and they seem to be doing fine socioeconomically, maybe climbing. And Bertie thinks that they are the farthest out of the crazies because they must have and have in order to live. But then, of course, they try to show restraint, and then he himself does not want to have, but does not want to suffer. So he's this homeless drug addict. What seemed so grand to Bertie, who admired all impossible positions, was that they believed both things with equal intensity, never suspecting for a moment any inconsistency. And that's a great sentence right there. It says so much about Bertie and his outlook, his worldview, that he would think that they are the ones that are crazy. And he, this very unique and bedraggled homeless man, would be the one who is completely sane. Which I would not entirely disagree with. Bertie then postpones his drug taking, which we never really find out what drug it is. They say he's into mescaline, but he calls all drugs drugs. He doesn't specifically say what type, so it's not clear exactly what he's about to do. It's a white powder. He resists until sundown, and at sundown he finally takes it, at which point he begins hallucinating, and it goes into kind of a David Lynchian, I don't want to say dream sequence, but a kind of a trip. And this is one of the parts that, if you're reading it now in 2024, it's a little bit, it's dated, there's ethnic stereotypes and you could say racism, I suppose, even though I think at the time it's not particularly racist in the sense that he's looking down on others. He does use the word Negroes when he's talking about other, jazz musicians. But anyway, this sequence has a Chinaman that's this mystical 2-foot-tall hallucination of a Chinese man dressed in Oriental robes. But I feel like it's not so much that he is a stereotype. It's a stereotype in terms of the mystical Oriental kind of thing, but it's more, I think, just the way that the author decided to center this trip on a mystical being, decided to make it someone from China, kind of a stereotype about the mystical monk or the enlightened being. So I don't find it to be overly offensive, but of course it is very dated, reading it now. So after the truth and the meaning of life emanate from the mouth of the Chinese man, Bertie immediately runs to the phone and he calls up his friend. He has to wake up in the middle of the night, and he starts explaining this whole vision that he had and how he's discovered the meaning of life. And his friend asks him, "So what was it?" And he said, "Well, it was in Chinese." "But Bertie, you can't read Chinese." "But I could, in this vision I could read." "So what was the meaning of life?" And "I forgot," and he hangs up the phone. And then he basically curls up in a ball and wakes up the next morning feeling absolutely awful. And then comes the raiding of the Feldman's liquor cabinet for the last bottles. He polishes off the bottle of scotch, which he doesn't even like, and passes out in an alcoholic stupor. And when he wakes up, that is the final act of the story. That is the big sort of twist that leads up to the twist that comes at the end. And I'm not going to spoil that for you. I really hope you could read the story on your own if you're interested in old weird stories from the 1960s. I found this story really fascinating. It was one of the few times that when I finished it, I went back and I read the whole thing all over again, which I almost never do. There's only been a handful of books and stories that I've ever done that with. So it was really one of those that I was kind of like, this is really weird. I want to go back and sort of look at how he did that. And I was very amazed at Stanley Elkin's ability to take a character like Birdie and to completely flesh him out when, for the majority of the story, he is the only character. There's very few times that he interacts with anyone, but yet he's doing voices and he's pulling in these pieces of his past and he's talking with a talk show host on TV, in his imagination. And it's just absolutely clever. It's so clever how he does that. And also I feel like there's a little bit of satire toward the remains of the Beat Generation, because Birdie is this, failed trumpet player who is sort of wandering around and getting more and more beaten down as the years go by. But I don't think Stanley Elkin was condemning the lifestyle. I think he was just painting a portrait of this drug addict who used to be something, and he has sort of never changed. All of his friends are either locked up in jail or they've become sort of like the Feldmans, these well-to-do people getting on with their lives, and Birdie is kind of stuck. It's a warts and all portrait, and he brings the reader along for this very wild ride that's very, very funny. It's tragic, but it's funny. And the humor is brought out even more so by the tragedy, I think. You will remember Birdie after finishing this. In a similar way, maybe if you've ever read anything by Dennis Johnson, like if you ever read Jesus' Son, kind of has a similar feel in a way, not as dark, but just as funny. I think the humor is similar. Heroin addict comedy. It also kind of reminded me of Malone Dies, which is the second of Samuel Beckett's trilogy. The narrator is confined to a bed. He seems to be in some kind of a hospital or probably an institution. He only vaguely recalls his memories, and he's sort of trying to write this story. He also is doing voices to a degree and seeing visions in his mind. Kind of also reminded me a little bit of Beckett in that kind of the singular character being flayed out and showing all of the bizarre inner world. I'm always on the lookout for weird fiction, for unique stories that make me sit back and go, wow, what the hell was that? Stanley Elkin is a writer who is very overlooked, in my opinion. I don't know if that's because he's comedic or... but anyway, his books go in and out of print. This story, The Guest, is found in his collection Criers and Kibitzers, Kibitzers and Criers, which I believe was his first short story collection in the early 1960s. And Stanley Elkin had multiple sclerosis, and he maintained such a joyous level of humor, and his writing is very entertaining, even when it's tragic. So that's about all I've got. I'm gonna stay here in my Tsundoku Vault, digging through things. I'll probably make more videos about those things. Thank you so much.